There's a specific kind of American mythology that takes men who were complicated, violent, morally questionable, and pretty often catastrophic to be around. And it kind of sands down the rough edges just enough for them to be safe enough for a statue. John Paul Jones is one of those men. At our very worst, we're better than most people. And at our very best, we could wipe the floor with a lot of them. My name is Kevin. We're talking about John Paul Jones, and this is History Goon. John Baldwin was born in Sidcup, Kent on January 3rd, 1946. He started playing piano when he was 6 years old, learning from his father, Joe Baldwin. Son of a bitch. This is the wrong John Paul Jones. This is the guy from Led Zeppelin. Give me just a second. Anyway, the John Paul Jones we're talking about, the correct one, is actually the father of the American Navy. There's a plaque, there's a crypt under the Naval Academy Chapel, there's even a destroyer named after him. What the plaque leaves out, though, is that he had a questionable past before the Revolutionary War. He was a murderer and a slave trader, but he's also suspected of some other stuff afterwards that would earn him a ticket to a wood chipper, in my opinion. But we'll get to that when we get to it. He's also, without question, one of the most extraordinary naval commanders in the history of warfare. And he uttered one of the most badass lines of all time: "I have not yet begun to fight." My name's Kevin, and this is actually History Goon. John Paul Jones was born July 6th, 1747, in a small little cottage on the estate of Abergland, near the village of Kirkbean, which, if that doesn't sound American, it's because it's not. That's on the southwest coast of Scotland, on the north shore of the Solway Firth, where Scotland kind of stares across the water at England. It's one of the little peninsulas off of Scotland. His father was also John Paul, hence the junior, but he was the head gardener on the estate, which in the 18th century meant something closer to like a landscaped architect. He designed and maintained these elaborate formal gardens on the estate that was owned by a wealthy landowner named William Crack. It's definitely skilled work. If you've ever seen anybody that carves things out of shrubs,
the art of bush manipulation,
it takes some skill to do so. It's also respectable work, and it was absolutely not something that our boy John Paul Jones Jr. is going to do. He was the fourth of 7 children, 2 of whom died pretty young. Again, common, it's the 1700s. The family wasn't poor in a way that meant that they were starving, but they weren't really comfortable either. They lived on the estate in the estate's cottage at the estate's pleasure, which means the class dynamic there of their existence is pretty clear from birth. These people have money, you don't. You live here as long as these people want you to. This is going to be relevant later, because one of the defining features of John Paul Jones's entire life was an obsessive need to be treated as an equal by men who considered themselves his social betters. And he never stopped fighting for that kind of respect. But he also never fully got it. And the rage that came from this gap drove him to do some wild shit that we're going to talk about as we go. You guys have no idea how excited I am for this episode. Not only for the fact that John Paul Jones is excellent, for the most part. This is the closest I've come to doing a pirate so far. And the next 3 weeks after this are going to be a complete bummer. I have 3 that I didn't really look at, like breaking them up in the timeline until I looked at my board after I've got them written and I went, oh no. So it's going to be a total bummer. But I'm going to do something fun after that. As a boy, he spent his school time at Kirkbean School, and his actual time, like off time, he spent down at the port of Casethorne, which was like the local fishing, trading harbor, that kind of area. While he's down there, he's obviously talking to sailors. He's climbing all over ships. Um, he's acting out small naval battles with other kids and giving orders, which is awesome. He, from a very young age, had a call, like a calling from the sea. Like somewhere deep in his heart, he's like, I need to be on the water. He's about 12 years old when he decides to answer that call. William Crack, the laird whose family employed his father and basically his entire family, he's got an illegitimate son, shocker, rich people with extra kids that they didn't know about, especially back at this point in time, named James Crack, who's gone to America to become a doctor, and he's a very close friend of one of my favorite presidents, George Washington. And he would actually be one of the doctors that attended Washington on his deathbed. Kind of a big deal. The Crack family connection almost certainly helped the Paul family kind of secure what's going to happen next, which was an apprenticeship for young John with a Scottish merchant shipper named John Younger, who operated out of Whitehaven, which is a port on the English side of the Solway Firth in Cumberland. We're going to revisit Whitehaven in the future. In 1760, at the tender age of 13 years old, John Paul sailed as a cabin boy aboard the merchant ship Friendship from Whitehaven to Virginia, where his older brother William had already emigrated to and was working as a tailor in Fredericksburg. This is the first of many connections that he's going to make in Virginia throughout his life. He visited William, he saw the colonies, he saw what someone without noble connections or like inherited land or a name or important family basically could become in the New World if he had the drive and the want to do it. After he notices this, he goes back to the sea. He spends several years sailing the merchant routes between Britain, Barbados, and Virginia, getting a grasp of ocean travel and routes and all that. More importantly, learning actual navigation, which is very important. And he's learning this at a fairly young age. He was, by all accounts, a pretty serious and focused like student of the sea. John Younger's business failed in 1766, so obviously the business fails. Everybody's got to go. He's released from his apprenticeship, and now he's got to find new work. Now he's got to show that drive that can make you become something in America. Unfortunately, he found that drive as a slave trader. This is part of it that the plaques leave out. In 1764, at 17 years old, John Paul signed on as the third mate aboard the slave ship King George, operating out of Whitehaven. 2 years later, he transfers to the crew of a ship. The English, back then, unless they were pirates, couldn't name ships for shit. This ship's called Two Friends, which is, a kind of ironic name for a 50-foot-long slave ship that was sailing out of Kingston, Jamaica. But he did get the role of first mate, so he's high up on the ship. He made multiple voyages between West Africa and the Caribbean, participating in the transport of, obviously, enslaved people across the Atlantic. And again, the slave trade is tricky because there's a lot of moving parts that went into it. And there's a lot of stuff that people don't like to talk about with the slave trade. Like, who was actually enslaving these people in the first place and selling them. think I've made the reference before. There wasn't white dudes chasing these guys around with butterfly nets. Just picturing some like 5'6" British dude with jacked up teeth chasing a guy around that's built like LeBron James with a fucking butterfly net, and he just turns around and just stiff arms him in the face like a like a running back. So after 2 years, he quits in 1768. And then he books passage on a ship back to Scotland. He described the slave trade as what he referred to as, quote, an abominable trade. Absolutely. To his credit, like, obviously he left doing this, and that's a good thing. It shows that he has kind of a moral compass that may not work at some points in time, but and honestly, he was like 19 or 20 years old when he did this in a world where this is all legal, it's sanctioned, it's profitable. But the fact that he found it completely appalling is worth noting because nobody else did, including legendary piece of shit that we spoke about last season, Nathan Bedford Forrest, which if you haven't listened to that episode, go back and listen to that one. That one's good. On the passage back to Scotland aboard a ship called England, please, the John of Kirkcudbright. It's a notorious buyer of prostitutes, just in this one particular area. Both the captain and the chief mate died of yellow fever somewhere in the crossing, which, just for shits and kicks, what is yellow fever? So just for reference, yellow fever, according to AI through Google, is an acute mosquito-borne viral disease found in tropical and subtropical regions of Africa and South America. Mosquitoes can fly, so you can get it here too, I guess. Symptoms include, in the mild phase, fevers, chills, headaches, back pain, muscle aches, nausea, and fatigue. Severe phase, about 15% of people enter a toxic phase characterized by recurring high fever, abdominal pain, liver and kidney damage, and severe bleeding. Mortality at this stage can be as high as 20 to 50%. Yellow fever is probably not something to f around with, I guess. But anyway, these guys did. And somewhere in the crossing, they both died. John Paul was the most qualified person remaining aboard to run this ship. When he took over, he navigated the ship back to Scotland safely with no other casualties. And this impressed the Scottish owners of the ship so much that they made him master and commander of it at 21 years old. I shouldn't have been in charge of myself at 21 years old, let alone a ship full of people. But anyway, it doesn't matter because he was good at it. He ran 2 voyages to the West Indies aboard the John and established a reputation as a pretty competent and, by all accounts, demanding commander. But 2 incidents during these voyages established a little bit of a different reputation for him as well. During his second voyage in 1770, one of the crew, a ship's carpenter named Mungo Maxwell, was flogged for what Paul described as insubordinance and insolence. Now, if you don't know what flogging is, it's basically beating somebody with a whip or a stick or something like that. And it's usually just as, an attention getter to make sure that you're staying in line. Maxwell died shortly after, and his father accused Paul of murder. Paul was arrested in Tobago, tried, and he was acquitted off of the witness statement or testimony, whatever you want to call it, from the master of another ship who wasn't there when it happened, but he provided sufficient evidence of Paul's innocence. But it didn't really matter because the story followed him, because you killed a guy, Every subsequent enemy he made would bring this story up. And the second incident was a little bit worse than the first. In 1773, Paul is commanding a different vessel, this one named the Betsy. So we've gone from a guy that buys hookers to an old-timey cow name, which was a 22-gun merchant ship working the West Indies around the areas of Tobago. There's a little bit of a dispute over some wages. The crew wanted to pay early. He said no. The ringleader of the near mutiny came at him. Now, exactly what happened in the hold of the ship is lost to history, and it's disputed throughout. Even at the time, it was disputed as to what actually happened. What's not disputed is the fact that when the guy came at him, John Paul put a sword directly through his guts and killed him. It's self-defense. I mean, the dead man was a local of Tobago, and the family of the previous victim of John Paul was still influential in the islands, and they took him to an admiralty court, um, which actually took like months to assemble to get all these admirals together to have like a court martial, basically. He'd be held in Tobago under suspicion of, again, murder. Well, what vague legal machinery there was at the time is kind of like coming to the conclusion of, seeing what they can do here. And because this is taking so long and he really doesn't know which way it's going to go, he splits. He runs back to Virginia. Well, got on the ship back to Virginia because you can't really run across the ocean unless you're, that one guy. He gets back there where his brother William had actually recently died without any heirs and left everything to John Paul, basically to like settle up his estate. He arrived in Virginia sometime around 1774, 1775 with no ship, no money, and a warrant potentially outstanding for his arrest. At some point during this period, and nobody can really pin down the exact time, he adds the surname Jones. So he is now officially John Paul Jones. Because it was that easy back then to just be like, John Paul, never heard of him, I'm John Paul Jones. That's probably where the whole John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt thing came from, is just a guy, just named John Jacob, and he got into trouble for, penetrating somebody's wildlife, and then had to just keep adding names to it and run, and then make it impronounceable and inconceivable to try to spell. And then he ran into that one other guy. And I think they had to have like a Highlander duel to like really settle it up to see, who it was. Either that or it's like the Siths where they have like the rule of two, where they can only be two of them. And they have to go around to kill all the other John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidts. This is going nowhere. Anyway, he became John Paul Jones, and he was in Virginia when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. By that summer, he was in Philadelphia meeting revolutionary leaders and positioning himself to make the case that a man of his abilities and experience was exactly what the fledgling Continental Navy is going to need. And he's not wrong. The Continental Navy is just like essentially just now being built completely from scratch. Congress is converting merchant ships into warships, recruiting officers, trying to create like a functional naval force to go up against the biggest navy on the planet at the time. And they are in desperate need of like good leaders and people that know what they're doing. And it just so happens that John Paul Jones had spent his entire life on the ocean. And, at one point in time, he ran a ship with guns on it. So that's a plus, right? He's 27 years old and he's already commanded a ton of different ships. What's really fun is that the U.S. Navy was created in Whitehall, New York, and launched into the Skenesboro Harbor under the supervision of future episode topic. There's not even a possibility to that. The only possibility of what I'm about to say is he's the most justifiable traitor in U.S. history, Benedict Arnold. And if you don't know anything about him, yes, he was a traitor. But I get it. Because he got bad. And then to add insult to injury, if you go find his monument in Saratoga, it's a leg. Not even a full statue, just his leg, for a reason that we'll talk about when we talk about him. So the reason I brought all of that up with Whitehall, it's like 45 minutes from my house. I could be, as of time of recording, I could be in Whitehall before the sun goes down. So I've been there before. On December 7th, 1775, John Paul Jones was commissioned first lieutenant of the Continental Navy and assigned to the newly converted 21-gun frigate, the USS Alfred, which is the flagship of the Continental Navy's First Fleet, which is commanded by Commodore Esek Hopkins. That's a name. ESEK. Whew. Man. I mean, why would I think the British could name people? They can't name boats. On February 17th, 1776, John Paul Jones raised the Continental Ensign, the Grand Union flag, which was the first iteration of what would become the Stars and Stripes on the Alfred. So I know if you're watching on video, you're going to see a new flag, but you're going to be like, what the hell is that? That's it. That's it right there. Such a dork. I bought that flag specifically for this episode. It's coming down after this. I spent $9 on that flag for this episode. And then I guess I could probably put it up for part of the Benedict Arnold episode when I do that. And then I'll have to switch and get a different one. And Jesus Christ, I'm going to have so many flags. Oh, I'm going to be in debt. I'm going to be in flag debt. You guys need to help me. But he raised that flag with his own hands up the mast as it sailed out of the Delaware River on its maiden cruise. There's a line that you see in a lot of sources, like he was the first man to raise the American flag on a naval vessel. Depending on what flag you're counting, yes, but also maybe not. Who knows? This cruise took the Alfred and the small fleet down to the Bahamas, where they raided Nassau and captured a large supply of British military stores, including cannons, mortars, ammunition, the kind of stuff that you need when you're trying to fight the biggest military on Earth and you don't have the means to make it yourself. And while he's doing that, there's some drunk prick from Vermont and his brother and 5 other dudes that are going to Fort Ticonderoga just across Lake Champlain and doing basically the same thing and then sending them all back to Massachusetts and Virginia. Then getting a cable company named after him. Even though he didn't do shit, he stayed in the boat. Ira did all the work. Anyway, on the return voyage, they got into a little bit of a kerfuffle with a British frigate called the HMS Glasgow, and they lost this fight. The Glasgow is faster, it's more maneuverable, better handling than Alfred, and the fleet's performance on the American side was completely embarrassing. Commandant Hopkins took most of the criticism from Congress when it came down to it. Jones kind of dodged a lot of it, mostly because everyone agreed that his individual performance was outstanding. And from there, he'd be given command of the sloop Providence in 1776 and spent the later parts of that summer and in the fall raiding British ships and coastal positions from Bermuda to Nova Scotia with a pretty high level of success. The notes that I found here said 8 prizes captured, 8 more sunk or burned. British frigates outfoxed repeatedly. So 8 prizes, meaning they captured 8 British ships. They sunk another 8 or burned them. And then now we got more ships in the fleet, man. This is pretty sweet. And it's also something that stopped happening because as naval warfare evolved, you can't just take a ship unless you're Somali pirates. But you can't do that. Could you imagine if we had... That's not true. We stole a submarine in World War II. Yeah, we did that. But can you imagine if we sent a fleet out during World War II up against the Yamamoto, and we're taking that, and just stole an aircraft carrier? That would have been awesome. But instead, we made the world's largest man-made underwater reef out of it instead. Later that year, he's back on the Alfred, taking more prizes and continuing to establish himself as the most efficient and aggressive officer in the Continental Navy. At the same time, he's also driving his superiors completely out of their minds. He had a lot of opinions about how things should be done, and he was not afraid to express those at length in volume to anyone who would listen, including members of Congress, commanders, and other people who very, very much did not want to hear his thoughts on things. They wanted him to just go out and kill British ships. And he's like, well, I'm going to tell you something about that too. And he was surprisingly not a very patient man when it came to incompetent officers on his ships. And didn't hide that from anybody. He wrote long letters complaining about being passed over for promotion. He's constantly feuding with other officers over seniority and rank. The Continental Navy's officer corps was full of people that were there because they were politically connected, not because they were good at what they did. And from a guy like John Paul Jones, who has had to work for everything he's ever had and is better at all of them than that, at what they're trying to do, without needing to have a congressman know them to get him a job. This infuriated him. Kind of like, when we get sucked into a war somewhere and we potentially have to send people across the sea to die in a desert somewhere. And nobody in Congress is going to have to send their kids. It's just us, normal folks, that get to go die like that, not them. Fear that we're reaching a point where voting won't make a difference anymore and we'll have to change things other ways. But I'm not inciting violence. I'm merely making a factual statement. In 1777, Congress gave him the Ranger, which finally we have a ship with a cool name. It took this long. It's an 18-gun sloop that had been built in New Hampshire. It was being sent to France to collect a bigger ship, the frigate Indian, which is being constructed in Amsterdam for American use, because the Dutch were no friend of the English. And neither were the French. Still, I guess. Jones sails for France in November 1777, arriving at the French port of Nantes in December. The Indian had already been sold to the French under British diplomatic pressure. So he sailed over there to get this boat, and it's not there. What he found instead was Paris. And while he was in Paris, he met the man who invented electricity and at least a handful of variants of venereal disease, Benjamin motherfucking Franklin. Franklin at this point in time was the American commissioner to France, so basically like the ambassador to France. He's operating out of his residence at Passy, which is dangerously close to what Benjamin Franklin was constantly chasing while he was in France. He's also the most famous American in Europe at this point in time. He's a celebrated scientist, an author, the creator of the Farmer's Almanac. He's a philosopher, beloved by the French intellectual class and also the French lower class, because for all of his high-end things he was doing, Benjamin Franklin was kind of a dirtbag. But, I think we already kind of knew that, right? I'm not even talking about the Hellfire Club yet. Jones was sucked into his orbit, and the two men immediately just loved each other. Franklin is charmed by how intense Jones is and how competent he is with everything. And Jones is just as charmed by Franklin's connections and his ability to actually make things happen, unlike Congress. And they genuinely became friends while they were there. This wasn't just a friendship of convenience for politics. They were actually buddies. And I could only imagine the havoc that they wreaked on the streets of France. Good God, man, that would have smelled so bad. In February 1778, France and the United States signed a treaty of alliance, which is kind of a good thing for us at the time. France was now officially involved in the American Revolution on our side, which meant that the careful diplomatic dancing and footwork that Jones has been performing to avoid pissing French officials off while he's in France is no longer necessary. He can operate openly. He can start planning offensives while he's here. And he'd been thinking about something for months and months and months. And now he could actually do it. 8 days after the treaty was signed, the Rangers sailed into the roadstead off Franklin's absolute favorite port in France, Brest, and a French warship fired a 9-gun salute in return. This would be the first time that a foreign nation had formally saluted an American vessel. Think we need an eagle scream right there. Jones had negotiated things in advance pretty carefully, working out protocol of how many guns each side would fire as diplomatic recognition, stuff like that. And he wanted it on record that this happened, and he got it. And then he went and attacked England. I love this guy. Oh, man. Until later. I'm going to keep reminding myself until later. Because he gets to be less than desirable. But right now, he's an American hero. And I love the fact that he's just we're fighting in America for America. What should I do? Attack England. So this plan is pretty ballsy in the way that things can be ballsy when not that you don't have anything to lose, you're just not afraid of anybody. He proposed to bring the war to British soil. Not just the shipping lanes out in the seas, British soil itself. The specific target that he has in mind is he is going back to Whitehaven, the port on the Cumberland coast where his entire career began, basically. He knows the harbor. He knows the layout of the fortifications. He knows the tides. He grew up there. He knows everything about this place. His argument to Congress and to Franklin was pretty strategic. A raid on Whitehaven would shatter the British public sense of security, proving that the Royal Navy, they can't protect you at home because they're too busy fighting over here. This would also cause the insurance rates on British shipping to spike, which would then put pressure on the British government to divert naval resources home to keep them safe there, to try to lower these insurance rates. And this would give the very, very much struggling American cause a win in the propaganda department. And that would go all the way across Europe. It's basically seafaring terrorism, and I am all for it. And so was Benjamin Franklin. The raid was approved on April 10th, 1778. The Rangers sailed out of Brest with 140 men, 18 6-pound cannons, and just a belly full of cannonballs. Crew on the Ranger was not overly enthusiastic about this idea. Many of them were New Englanders who had signed on for basically whatever money they could make by being legal pirates. They hadn't signed on to attack fortified English harbors and military bases in the dark. So to put that into different words, they want to play pirates. They don't want to play Marines. They thought Jones is reckless. He's out of his mind. And some of them actively hated him. His senior officers were a thorn in his side. Jones later wrote that their objective was, quote, gain, not honor, and that instead of encouraging the morale of the crew, they excited them to disobedience. These are his direct subordinates that are essentially trying to get their direct subordinates to start a mutiny against the captain that's killed 2 people for insubordinates. The initial attack was planned for the night of April 20th, but contrary winds forced them to abandon this. The night of April 22nd into the 23rd, 2 small boats with about 30 men each rowed into the dark harbor. We've got John Paul Jones leading one, and Lieutenant Wallingford of the Marine Corps leading the other. They row into this harbor where there's anywhere between 200 to 400 wooden ships packed together in the mud at low tide, so they can't go anywhere. The plan was for Jones's group to spike the guns on the fort that are protecting the harbor. So what that is you take a metal spike, you put it into the end of the barrel, and you slam it in, and it basically destroys the gun because you can't unplug it. And you can't just fire it because it'll, Looney Tunes style, go kerflooey and fly everywhere. The other half of this plan is for Wallingford's group to set fire to the ships. And the goal here is to burn the entire harbor to the ground, or water, whatever. Jones's group reached the fort. They scaled the walls in the dark. They actually had to climb on each other's shoulders like human ladder style and secure the guards without any bloodshed. They took these guys completely by surprise. They spiked the guns. So far, so good. And then several things all went wrong at once. Wallingford's group, that's supposed to be setting the ships on fire, apparently made landfall and went directly to a pub instead. This is actually documented. They all got drunk. I mean, I did say that these guys were Marines, and that is the most Marine thing that you could do from the people that I know that were Marines. Now, by the time they stumbled back to the ships, they found out that their torches had all gone out. They couldn't find material to relight them. One of Jones's own men, an Irishman named David Freeman, who was he's got a grudge for some reason against Jones, slipped away and started knocking on the townspeople's doors, warning them that their ships were about to be set on fire. The fact that this guy was Irish and went out of his way to help the British shows just how much he didn't like John Paul Jones. Either that or he was Northern Irish, which is just British with a different accent. So the town wakes up. And at this point in time, John Paul Jones is so pissed off that he lights torches himself and then himself gets aboard the coal ship Thompson and the neighboring Slatham and set fires in the holds and retreated. One of those situations of if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. By the time the townspeople arrived with buckets, only a handful of the ships had caught fire, and the Thompson was the only one that suffered actual serious damage. The rest of the fleet was saved. Militarily, the Whitehaven raid was a failure. As propaganda, it was one of the most successful operations in the entire Revolutionary War. Britain is now concerned that they can be attacked by these savages with the same accents as them from across the sea. And the other thing that really concerned them is this is the first time that a foreign power had actually attacked the mainland of England since the Dutch hit them at Medway in 1667, over 100 years before that. And the newspapers went insane. The Cumberland Chronicle, which was a newspaper, used the largest typeset that it had for the headline, "Unparalleled Imprudence." And debates kicked off in Parliament about coastal defenses, insurance rates spiked, panic spread across the English Isles. The message it sent to every port in Britain was pretty simple: you are not safe here. Your Navy cannot protect you. The Americans can reach you whenever we want. As a bonus for all of this, Jones received a pardon from the town of Whitehall in 1999, 221 years later. And they even actually put up a statue of him, which is pretty neat. Probably wasn't the homecoming that they wanted out of him, but it's the one they got. From Whitehaven, Jones crossed the Solway Firth back to Scotland. The next target was the estate of Dunbar Douglas, the 4th Earl of Selkirk, who lived on St. Mary's Isle near Kirkcudbright. Jones's idea was to take the Earl hostage and exchange him for American sailors who were being held as criminals in British prisons. Whew. The balls on this guy. The British position was that these guys weren't sailors, they were pirates. And they were subject to execution rather than exchange. He's really good at planning stuff, but he's really bad at timing things, because when they got there, the Earl wasn't home. His wife, the Countess of Selkirk, on the other hand, was. She received Jones's officers politely and with remarkable composure, which they made note of. She held it together pretty well for a woman who's having her home invaded by American pirates, basically. JPJ sat down with her and negotiated. And he told his officers to treat the family with respect and take nothing. His crew, however, who had been on this raid for several days without anything, without money, were not satisfied with this order. And they demanded something in return for their politeness to show that they actually accomplished something here. Jones tried to keep his crew from going completely feral and also tried to keep the raid from turning into a war crime, permitted them to take the family's finest silverware. Then he did something completely unusual. He wrote the Countess a letter, a formal, courteous apology letter, in which he explained his intentions, expressing, a little bit of regret that her husband was absent, and he promised to return the silver at his own expense when the war ended. In his letter, he described himself as, quote, a man who was born on your shores and who had lived near enough to your ladyship to respect you as a neighbor. Then he sent the letter to her. After the war, he bought the silver back from the crew with his own money that he had earned from raiding and returned it with another letter to the Selkirk family. Lady Selkirk wrote a charming response saying she had originally thought he was a pirate, but now understood he was a gentleman. So here's a little bit of an internal contradiction with him. He could at the same time be this actual gentleman who treated a highborn lady with a lot of respect and made sure that his crew treated her with respect as well. Or he could be the guy who would kill you for being insubordinate on his ship. There's a little give and take there. He wrote long, eloquent letters about honor and liberty and the rights of man, and was more than occasionally an absolute nightmare to have as your commander. He did genuinely believe in what the revolution stood for, and he also genuinely believed that he personally deserved more recognition and a higher rank and more money than he was getting for what he was doing, and he would never stop telling people that. He's complicated, From Scotland, the Ranger crossed the Irish Sea to, Carrickfergus on the northern coast of Ireland. I almost said 14-gun British slut, but that's definitely not it. Where the 14-gun British sloop HMS Drake was anchored. Jones tried to, sneak alongside the Drake at night because if we can, we want to take this thing. We don't want to sink it. So we want to broadside it and then board the ship. Unfortunately, the guy running the anchor dropped a little bit too late and the timing is off. Jones later wrote he was drunk. Not him, the guy operating the anchor was drunk. And they ended up having to cut the cable and run, which means they're now missing an anchor, which is not ideal when you're on the ocean. He would then come back in the daylight on April 24th and challenge the Drake directly. And after an hour-long fight that killed and wounded most of the Drake's senior officers, the British ship surrenders. This is the first Royal Navy warship captured by American naval forces in British home waters. Jones sails back to France with the Drake as a prize and about 200 prisoners. He's received in France as a hero, obviously. In America, the newspapers are celebrating him, and the British are calling him a pirate. If the shoe fits, right? British cartoonists drew him as a villainous pirate terrorizing the English coastline. And depending on the perspective, he was either the most dangerous naval commander that the Americas had produced up to that point in time, or a cold-blooded, murderous criminal dressed up in a naval uniform. Like a British naval officer. He's probably both, though. Now, back in France, Jones is given command of a converted French East India Company ship called the Duc de Daras, which was gifted to the United States by King Louis XVI. Probably, I don't know. I don't know where I would rank that King Louis. Definitely lower than the one from the Jungle Book, though, because that King Louis is pretty sweet. And this is another neat part, because this ship was gifted to the U.S., like I said, on the recommendation of Benjamin Franklin and a French shipping magnate named Jacques Donnet Larrey. John Paul Jones hates the name of this ship, understandably, because it's a terrible, god-awful French thing. He names it the Bonhomme Richard, which means Poor Richard. He named it after Franklin's Farmer's Almanac, as a tribute to the man who helped pretty much make all of this stuff possible. She's a big, old, slow ship, originally built in 1765 for the French India trade. It's now been refitted as a 42-gun warship, which means it's got 21 guns on each side. That's a lot of guns. But the problem is it's not a particularly good warship. Kind of a piece of shit, but it was his piece of shit, right? In a letter to LeRae before sailing, Jones wrote, quote, "I wish to have no connection with any ship that does not sail fast, for I intend to go into harm's way," which is gangster. Don't give me some slow piece of shit. I'm going to go out looking for trouble. And that sentence was quoted in pretty much every biography of Jones that's ever been written, and it deserves to be. Like, it's so cool. Then he assembles a small squadron, a ship called Alliance, which is a 36-gun American frigate, Palace, which is a 32-gun converted merchantman, Vengeance, a 12-gun brig, and Le Cerf. He also had 2 pirate ships join him that kind of peeled off after an argument between the captains. The squadron sailed from the French port of Garot on August 14th, 1779. This adventure was, by pretty much any measure, a catastrophe. It's an absolute dog bungle from the beginning. Jones's most significant problem here was Pierre Landis, who's the captain of the Alliance. Landis is a French officer who's been given command of Alliance. He was incredibly jealous of Jones and had a relationship with his commanding officer that ranged anywhere between being slightly insubordinate, like just kind of being a petty little prick, to outward hostility towards John Paul Jones. Which, if you've been listening, that's a really bad idea. Because he's not afraid to, like, kill you. You know? This guy's defying orders. He's taking ships independently. And he kind of just, like, operated like John Paul Jones's authority was more of a suggestion than actual authority. And Jones spent weeks, like, managing this situation while at the same time trying to, fight a war. Fight a war on 2 fronts. One is with an asshole, and the other is with this French guy, also an asshole. The other French captains were also a little reluctant to follow American orders because we're new. We're the new guys. We don't know what we're doing yet. See how that works for you in about 150 years, France. When you're all dug up and you got poison gas being thrown at you. And then again in another, 20 years after that, when your government off to North Africa and leaves you guys to get occupied by the Nazis. I mean, the British helped too, but whatever. I'm not going to give them any credit. I'll give them more credit than I'll give the Soviets, though. Because those guys. Anyway. They raided shipping routes around Scotland and Ireland for most of August and September, taking ships, harassing coastal towns, pretty standard stuff for these guys. Jones took his squadron up into the Firth of Forth. Firth of Forth. Okay. And he does this because he is planning to demand a ransom for the port of Edinburgh. And the French captains finally were like, okay, cool. Unfortunately, as they're trying to do this, they get hit with a pretty strong, westerly blowing wind, and it scatters the squadron, all to hell. He then tried the mouth of the Humber River. No joy there. He then moved north along the Yorkshire coast towards a headland called Flamborough Head. On the morning of September 23rd, 1779, the lookout spotted sails on the horizon. 40 British merchant ships were returning from the Baltic loaded with timber, iron, and naval supplies. Anything you'd need, anything the British would need to build and maintain more ships in their fleet. Escorting them were 2 Royal Navy warships, the HMS Serapis, which is a brand new 44-gun, copper-bottomed frigate that actually had 50 cannons on board, and the 20-gun sloop Countess of Scarborough. That name just strikes fear into the enemy, The Serapis was commanded by Captain Richard Pearson, who is a very experienced, very competent officer whose job is to get these merchant ships home safely. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the two forces spotted each other. 3 hours of like maneuvering and saber rattling, I guess would be the best term for it, followed while the light faded and the moon rose in the sky. Thousands of onlookers gathered on the high chalk cliffs of Flamborough Head to watch all of this. The two fleets were clearly visible from the shore in the clear autumn moonlight. This is something that has gone past the wayside, thankfully. I believe like after the Civil War here was pretty much one of the last times you would have seen that, where there'd be a battle and people are like, oh, sweet, grab the basket. We're gonna have a picnic and watch this. This is gonna be neat. It's 7 o'clock at night when Serapis and Bonhomme Richard finally close in with each other. Pearson hails Jones, quote, "What ship is that?" Jones answered something that amounted to basically nothing. Pearson calls again, quote, "Answer at once or I shall be under the necessity of firing into you." Still nothing from Jones. Both ships open fire at almost the exact same moment. The opening minutes were a nightmare for the Bonhomme Richard. Serapis was newer, faster, and way better armed. Two of the Bonhomme Richard's own 18-pound cannons exploded in their port windows on the first broadside, which blew holes in the gun deck and killed the crew of both guns, which sucks, especially when you need guys to operate these guns, and you just lost, I don't know, 2 to 3 men per gun. Oh yeah, and the 2 guns. This is going to be bad. Oh, and I also forgot to mention that after this, the Bonhomme Richard is starting to take on water. Jones's heaviest guns were already gone. He's outgunned, outmaneuvered, and taking damage at a rate that he cannot sustain and keep this boat floating. So he does the only logical thing, and he stops trying to fight at range and tries to close the distance. And when I say close the distance, he slams the Bonhomme Richard into the Serapis twice. At one point, Bonhomme Richard's bow was stuck in the Serapis's stern, and Pearson, noting the condition of the other ship, called over the rail, quote, "Has your ship struck? Do you call for quarters?" 2 members of Jones's crew had actually been calling for quarters because they didn't want to fight anymore, which, that's basically asking for surrender. Through the noise of the battle, Pearson could hear them shouting, and he assumed that one of them was Jones. Jones's reply became the most famous sentence in American naval history: "I have not yet begun to fight." Whether he said those exact words or some other version of that, we don't really know. That's the one that stuck. First Lieutenant Richard Dale, who was there, reported the line exactly as it was given. Other witnesses gave like slightly different versions. The exact phrasing doesn't matter. The fact that he was like willing to go down swinging does. The Bonhomme Richard was on fire. It's taking on water, which you would think one of those things would fix the other. It doesn't. It makes it worse. Half of her heavy guns are destroyed, and the captain told the British to go themselves. This is the most American that's ever existed, and he wasn't even born here. What followed this is the most brutal naval battle of the entire American Revolution. At 8:30 in the evening, the jib boom of the Serapis caught the Bonhomme Richard's caught the Bonhomme Richard's rigging as the ships passed each other. This is an opportunity that Jones has kind of been working towards. He grabbed a line himself and lashed the 2 ships together. Serapis tries to break free. Pearson drops his anchor, trying to use the weight of that to like swing the ships apart. And instead, the motion rotated the 2 vessels so that they ended up locked together stern to stern. The muzzles of their barrels are almost touching through the portholes. The British guns blasted off at one point at point-blank range into the Bonham Richards hull. The Americans fired back through closed portholes that had never been opened, which meant that they're firing straight through the wood of their own ship into the hull of the Serapis. Thousands of people on the Yorkshire cliffs watched both ships burn under the moonlight. Both vessels are now on fire. The threat of death by fire or smoke was so real that fighting was suspended at one point while both crews tried to put the flames out. Time out, time out. We don't want to die this way. We want to die the other way. Let's not burn to death here. Let's be rational adults and shoot each other and stab each other with swords. American Marines in the platforms up on the mast rained musket fire down and hand grenades down onto the Serapis's deck. They're picking off men that are trying to get to the wheel to control the ship. They're killing officers. They turned the upper deck of the Serapis into a killing floor. Some things don't change, do they, Marine Corps? There's one thing you guys are good at. It's killing shit. One American sailor hanging from the yardarm dropped a grenade down through a grate into the lower gun deck of the Serapis and hit a stack of cartridges. Which is bad. The explosion of the grenade in the cartridges created a chain reaction through a dozen more cartridges and blew a significant portion of the Serapis's gun deck apart. I would bet you my entire paycheck that the guy that chucked that grenade in there was drunk off his ass too. He was probably just hammered drunk and he's like, hey, check it out. Kobe or whatever. And then Pierre Landis, the captain of the Alliance, who's one of Jones's own ships, part of his own squadron, sailed up and fired 3 broadsides into the fight. He hit both ships. Was it intentional? I mean, I'm sure hitting the British ship was intentional. Was hitting the other American ship intentional? He doesn't like him, so probably. He hit the Bonham Richard 3 times. He killed a bunch of Americans because he could not or would not distinguish between the two vessels that are locked together in the smoke and darkness. His excuse later on was that he couldn't tell which ship was which. Okay, one has a British flag on it, which you know what that looks like because you hate them. It's genetic for you to not like them. The other one has a flag that's not British, and you hate them because you don't like the captain because he's better than you. Nobody bought his story. The prevailing opinion among most historians is that Landis had decided that Jones is probably losing this fight and that Jones is going to die. And by the firing into the whole kerfuffle here, he could claim to have defeated the Serapis himself when everything was said and done. Scumbag French. At 10:30 that night, Richard Pearson pulled down the flag and surrendered the Serapis. The battle lasted 3.5 hours. Roughly half the crews of both ships were killed or wounded. Estimates run to about 150 Americans and nearly as many British dead or wounded. This was just a slugfest. I know we've talked about people on here, people mentioning how long it feels like you're in a gunfight for when it's just a few seconds. Could you imagine dodging cannonballs, musket balls, and swords for 3.5 hours? I would need a nap after that. Like, I'm going to take like business week off and just sleep. But you can't. And why can't you just take a nap? Because the Bonham Richard is gutted. Her lower decks are flooded. Fires are still burning in multiple spots. And it's slowly settling down into the water. Jones spent 2 days trying to save this ship, and she sank in the morning of September 25th. He watched his probably not beloved warship sink from the deck of the Serapis. From here, they sailed to the neutral Dutch port of Texel with all of their prizes and winnings. He was welcomed as a hero. Franklin called it one of the most extraordinary naval actions in history. Probably not wrong. King Louis XVI of France awarded him the title of Chevalier, or he knighted him. So he's a French knight on a British warship with a Scottish accent and an American flag. And part of this knighthood is he gave him a golden sword, which is pretty rad. Congress awarded him the only gold medal ever given to a continental naval officer. In France, he's celebrated in the salons. He was painted by Charles Wilson Peale, who did the painting of Washington at Princeton. And of course, also he's just swamped by nobility and like intellectuals and people like that. Because he's a hero, he's a badass, and he's also friends with Ben Franklin. Sent letters back to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams about all of this. And I'm assuming they were just tickled pink with the fact that this guy was doing, just out here doing hood rat shit with his friends. Meanwhile, Landis was removed from command of the alliance. Then, like all good things, the American Revolution has to come to an end. We all know how it finished. We won. The British left, and they never bothered us again until like 1812, when they burned the White House down and ate all the food there. So the war comes to an end in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. The Continental Navy, having no ongoing reason to exist and no money to maintain it, is disbanded, which was a regular thing. We did not have a standing army unless we needed one. My, how things have changed. So Jones finds himself at a little bit of a crossroads here. He's got a new navy to serve in. He's owed an enormous amount of money he couldn't collect. And he also has the rank of captain, which the United States isn't going to promote him out of because they didn't create the rank of admiral. Because we can't have admirals because there's too much like connective tissue to the homeland for that. We don't want our officers to have British titles, which, I mean, they do now though. So from here, he adventures off to Europe. He spent a bunch of time in Paris and London. He's trying to collect money that he's owed. Some of it's collected, most of it's not. 3 of the 7 ships that he'd captured during his operations were requisitioned by Denmark. And they refused to pay him for those. He was awarded an annual pension by the Danish king instead, which was, it's something. I mean, it's not what he's owed, but it's something. And he's still owed a significant amount of money by the U.S. government that he never fully received. And he spent a long time harping on Congress to get him at least an admiral's commission, and that never came. In the summer of 1787, he returned to America one last time to receive his gold medal from Congress and to make one more attempt to get promoted and to get a command. And Congress was setting up a proper navy, like after a while. The last Continental Navy ship had been sold in 1785, and Jones wanted to lead it. He kind of like lobbied Thomas Jefferson, who was kind of sympathetic to his cause, but nothing ever really came through. In April of 1787, he made the decision that would kind of define the rest of his life. He took a job with Catherine the Great of Russia. The Russian Empire is at war with perennial bad guy on this show, the Ottoman Empire, for control of the Black Sea region, and Catherine needs capable naval commanders. And there just so happens to be a free agent. She actually sent people specifically to recruit Jones. She said of him, quote, "This man will get to Constantinople," when it was still Constantinople. And that was about the highest compliment that Catherine had given anyone. And she had this like weird set of rules where if you were a foreign commander, you couldn't fly the flag of like the Russian Empire. You couldn't get any kind of commission or rank or anything like that. She broke all these rules for John Paul Jones. She let him fly the Russian flag. She commissioned him directly as a rear admiral and gave him the command of the flagship Vladimir. He became known in... oh, this is so silly. He became known in the Russian Navy as Contra-Admiral Pavel Ivanovich Jones. There's something like weird and kind of sad about that whole thing. Like this guy that grew up in Kirkbean, Scotland, he's a gardener's son. He added Jones to his name to escape murder charges in the West Indies. He's now got a Russian first name in a foreign fleet fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Black Sea. And it's because he just constantly was chasing rank and recognition across his entirety of his career. And he finally found it, fighting for a foreign country again, in a Russian uniform, which is just strange. But he did have some success. In the summer of 1788, commanding a squadron of ships in the Dnieper-Bug-Liman, which is like a shallow estuary on the coast of the Black Sea in what's now Ukraine. And while he was there, he helped to destroy the Ottoman fleet near the fortress of Okov. Dude, the Russians. And then in this fight, the Turks lost 15 ships, 6,000 killed, 1,500 taken prisoner, which is a huge number. For his work here, he was awarded the Order of St. Anne by Catherine II. But the politics of the Russian Navy were a different kind of nightmare for him, like different than anything he's faced before. He's a foreigner in a court full of just like incredibly jealous, well-connected Russian nobles who don't like him because of his presence, and they also don't like him because of his reputation. Prince Charles of Nassau-Siegen, he was a Dutch mercenary, he's also a rear admiral for the Russians, was not a fan, would be the best way to put it. The British officers in Russian service, of whom there were many, because they were free to go do this stuff, they still don't like him because of the revolution. Potemkin, a man named Potemkin, which we'll talk about a ship named the Potemkin at some point on Patreon, patreon.com/1159media, was Catherine's most powerful minister and allegedly, boning down the queen, played all of these factions against each other. And we don't really know why. We don't really know if he had particular reasoning to pit these guys against each other, or if he just really enjoyed the chaos of it, which that's a possibility too. Within months, Jones found himself maneuvered out of any meaningful command of a ship. He's recalled to St. Petersburg under the kind of the pretext of being reassigned to the Baltic Fleet, and instead he found himself sitting in the capital without a command, without support, and surrounded by people that hate his guts. And then in March 1789, the worst thing that could have happened happened. There's an accusation made on March 31st, 1789. Oh boy, the mother of a 10-year-old girl named Katerina Stepanova came to the St. Petersburg police with a claim that Jones had raped her daughter. The girl, whose name was Goldswart, it's a terrible name, I'm sorry, had been visiting Jones's apartment selling butter, and asked about his laundry, stuff like that, because they would also take your laundry and go wash it. This accusation went directly to Catherine's desk. So what actually happened is still being argued about 200 years later. What the investigation actually produced, though, was Jones admitted in a statement to prosecutors that he had, quote, often frolicked with the girl for, quote, a small cash payment. But he denied rape. Figure that one out. She's 10. Yeah, you're paying her for it. That's still rape. So, he pulled the classic line of, I thought she was older than she actually was. He wrote in his defense, quote, I love women, I confess, and the pleasures that one only obtains from that sex. But to get such thing by force is horrible to me. She's 10. She can't consent. Therefore, my boy, that's a raping. The investigation established that the mother had lied about the girl's age. She was actually 12, not 10. And 12 was considered an early but legally acceptable age for sexual activity in Russia at the time, which is disgusting. It also kind of like established that Katerina had visited Jones on multiple previous occasions without any complaint. The charges were eventually dropped, but none of that mattered. The accusation was in the newspapers. His enemies at the court, almost certainly including our Danish pirate here. But of all the people that were against him, the one person he had on his side was the French ambassador. He stood with him like during the proceedings. Catherine, who had personally like wanted Jones to be recruited, and she was like really well known to like intervene in legal cases where women faced legal obstacles. She allowed the proceedings to continue past the window, like the what do you want to call it? Statute of limitations, I guess. That would have usually ended all of this. The charges were dropped. He was granted a 2-year leave of absence with full rank and pay retained. This was her way of firing John Paul Jones without, the other way of firing people that the Russians use, which would have been to execute him. So he appealed all this to Potemkin. Potemkin didn't respond. He left Russia in July of 1789, never to return, obviously, because you have that hanging over your head. That you did something terrible, but you kind of got away with it. Probably the best bet is to steer clear of Russia, period, or anybody that even speaks Russian. It's not comfortable to think about, but this guy that I've just been praising for the last however long this has been so far, as a hero and a total like naval badass, was paying to have sex with a child. Okay, it's not great. It's not great. The historical like record here kind of would lead you to believe that he's framed by some of these people that didn't like him. But even if he was framed by these people, he still has that like dark cloud over his head of, I have to leave the country because people think I did this. I don't know if he did it. I wasn't there. I hope that he didn't, but I think he probably did, realistically. On his way out of Russia, though, he stopped in Warsaw, Poland. Well, what would be Warsaw, Poland? And became friends with, oh, God bless the Polish, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was the Polish military leader, and he was an American Revolutionary War hero, who told him to never go back to Russia, but to look for employment with the Swedish Navy. And the Swedes passed. And then he got desperate because he went to the British Navy. And he was nearly killed in Harwich by people who recognized him and had not forgotten what he had done in Whitehaven. So he retreats back to London and then back to Paris. He arrives in Paris May 1790. He retained his Russian Rear Admiral's commission and pension, which was enough to like live on kind of quietly. He no longer has any friends in France, and the connections that he had had after the revolution are gone. The world and the sphere of people that had been like celebrating him a decade earlier have either been scattered or beheaded. Because right now we're getting into pre-French Revolution area. And Actually, this might be during the French Revolution. Yeah, we're coming up on the French Revolution, or it's already started, one of the two. And he finds himself incredibly sick. He's diagnosed with interstitial nephritis, which is a pretty gnarly kidney disease that doesn't get better. It just progresses until it kills you, basically. He spent his last 2 years in Paris trying to find something useful to do. He wrote a long account of the Lyman campaign, documenting what he believed were Nassau-Ziethen's failures and what he had contributed to it as well. He wrote to Thomas Jefferson, he wrote to George Washington, anybody that might be able to help him find a command or anything to do. Congress was not urgent to respond because they weren't a fan of him from the beginning, because they didn't like that he would tell them that they were screwing up and how they should be doing things. Also, the United States didn't have a navy. In June of 1792, President Washington finally appointed him U.S. Commissioner, so he now has full powers to negotiate with this one particular person who is the Dey of Algiers for the release of American sailors being held captive by the Barbary pirates. This is the kind of mission that he is perfectly suited for. It's like a combination of diplomatic skill and the reputation of being a naval commander who will blow the doors off of your ships if you get anywhere close to him. He'd been really good at all this stuff, but he never made it. Because on July 18th, 1792, he was found dead face down on his own bed in his third-floor apartment at number 19 Rue de Touraine in Paris. He was 45 years old. The cause of death was the kidney disease that had been slowly killing him for years. He died unmarried, no children, no family in France. He's owed a huge amount of money by multiple governments that they never paid. And the American press's obituaries had partially forgotten about his achievements during the Revolution. Which is, it's sad, because without him, who knows? Who knows how it would have turned out? Some papers in France described him as a French war hero, apparently not entirely sure which side of the war he fought for, even though he had a really decent reputation in France as an American naval commander. He was buried at St. Louis Cemetery, which is property of the French royal family. 4 years later, the French revolutionary government sold the cemetery property and it was built over, and he disappeared. In 1899, the American ambassador to France, General Horace Porter, decides he's going to make it his mission to find him. He spent 6 years and a ton of his own money tracking down the location of Jones's original burial site. And he had to do this working from a faulty copy, a flawed copy of the burial records. On April 7th, 1905, they found the lead coffin still sealed under a Paris building that had been constructed over the cemetery. They opened it. John Paul Jones is inside, preserved in alcohol, which is a pretty common practice for more notable people in the period of time. And forensic examination confirmed the identity through comparisons with portraits and physical measurements that they had of him. He'd been lying under an apartment building in Paris for 113 years. President Theodore Roosevelt sent 4 American warships to bring him home. Roosevelt himself presided over the ceremony at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. On January 26, 1913, all those years after he died alone in his apartment in Paris, after waiting for a mission that would never come through, his remains were interred in a magnificent bronze and marble sarcophagus beneath the Naval Academy Chapel. He's buried there to this day. The inscription above the crypt reads, quote, "He gave our Navy its earliest traditions of heroism and victory." So, I mean, for a man that started off as a slave trader and then got out of that business and became probably the greatest naval commander that America had produced up to that period in time, to fall the way he did, to being a child predator, basically. There's a lot of ups and downs in that life. And in the middle, he kicked the ass off of the British Navy for years. And then afterwards, to be owed all kinds of money by all kinds of people and to never collect it. And then to get desperate and go to another foreign country and join their Navy. I mean, I can definitely see the criticism that he gets for his actions towards the end, because there's no justifying that. It's disgusting. But how do you separate the two? Like, how do you... It kind of reminds me of like the whole Chris Benoit thing, where yes, he did something horrible and evil at the end of his life, but that means that you can't celebrate what he did at the beginning of it. Like what he did. I think you can, and I don't want to say you can separate what John Paul Jones did, because I don't know that you can. I think you can look at him as a hero up to a certain point. And then it's kind of like the Batman thing of, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And I think that's kind of what happened here. So he's a complicated man, but if it weren't for him, who knows? I don't know how to feel. Like, I just don't. And he was a total badass. Don't get me wrong, but he was also a child rapist at one point. So, do those two things wash each other out? Possibly. Can his achievements at the sticks of a couple of different warships be ignored? Absolutely not. Anyway, I'm too confused to keep talking, so I'm going to keep talking. I highly recommend everybody, if you want to get this early, if you want to get some bonus content from me, head over to Patreon, patreon.com/1159media. $5 a month gets you access to this show early, History Goon. That's this show that you've been listening to for the past 2 hours. Gets you access to everything else over at 1159 Media. And we're growing. The family is growing, and I love it. So I'm sure that you can find something over there that you'll like. I guarantee it. And also, because I haven't done this in a while, I've got a Ko-Fi. If you're going to throw me a tip, ko-fi.com/historygoonpod. You want to throw me $5? That's awesome. If you don't want to, that's also awesome. I would only ask that you spread the word. Tell people about it. If you're not on the YouTube channel yet, go over there and subscribe. You get all the video stuff, like you get all the episodes with video there, as well as what you would get on Spotify. So exposure helps. Anything helps. So even if you don't like people, just tell them, hey, I know this asshole with a microphone that's likes to talk about history. You might like it. Anyway, we're all going to die someday. So go out and do some goon shit and leave a mark on the world, just like John Paul Jones. Okay, love you. Bye.